things fall apart. Hopefully, we're not going to fall apart completely, but just when things fall apart, we tend to not like that very much. We're still working with Prentis Hemphill's book, What It Takes to Heal, how transforming ourselves can change the world. And this is chapter 7, I believe it is, Things Fall Apart. The reason I felt it was important to explore this is because we tend to avoid things that are hard, and conflict is hard for most of us. And also, we tend to avoid saying the truth. So, all of this on the slides here are quotes from Prentis's book. There's always something that we are most afraid of saying, the truth we protect at all costs. And I suspect that that's to do with the nervous system, with our core deficiency beliefs. They're saying here what makes us feel small, afraid. And also, we don't want to lose control. One of the things about, especially childhood trauma, is that we don't really control much about our environment. And then as an adult, we might get really double down into, I can't afford to be in conflict with some person or this person or with anyone. So if we believe in our core, in our own development, that we can grow and deepen and mature, that's what it takes for us to have the courage. But also, we're doing this within a context of it's not all that safe to be vulnerable in our culture. We need to have a culture that's more tender and that doesn't shame us. And that's part of what we build together in this group and in the breakout rooms, is we're building that feeling of it's safe enough for me to tell the truth. And then we get the reward of telling the truth and of having that be received without judgment. This lasts several years, but it's hard to pick a time when this is more true. Toni Morrison, this quote about it's important to not ignore the pain, and it's critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. So this is something that we're all affected by in different ways, probably partly depending on whether we tend to go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Prentis talking about conflict as a teacher. Sometimes we'd be better to let it in. I tend to keep it at a distance, would be my protective mechanism. Go into freeze, or also just to pretend that it's better than it is. And I don't really enjoy conflict, although I'm much, much more able to be present and allow it to do what it's doing and see what we need to see. One of the things that Prentis talks about, too, is how this nonstop consumption of conflict in movies, sports, news, social media is a byproduct of the collective anxiety we feel as we face uncertain and high-stakes futures. That's something else, too, that for many years, decades now, I haven't really watched the news because I've known how hard it is on my nervous system. But also, it's true as well that often we get hooked on that. And what Prentis is saying here is conflict entertainment, which I've never heard that term before, is a distraction from the deep, sustained engagement with our shared issues. And one of the reasons for that would be that we're kind of being pitted against each other. There's so much polarization. And the other side, so to speak, is seen as the person that is the problem. And really, it's the system that's more of a problem for us than another individual person. The system that gathers all the wealth in the top 3% of people. It's a system that makes it almost impossible for us to make a decent living and live a decent life without having 2 jobs or 3 jobs. It's the system that we need to be working this deep, sustained engagement with our shared issues. And also, I would say this shared work that we're doing of connecting. Our nervous systems have a lot to say about our capacity. So what do we need to know and do to get to the other side? And what makes one conflict generative, meaning it helps to move us towards understanding? And how can we engage in conflict while minimizing harm? If we've never had it modeled for us, in my family, like many, the modeling was we're going to pretend it's all okay and nobody's going to talk about it, and then it's not going to exist. So to have this model that we could actually say those hard truths that we're trying to avoid saying, and we can manage that. We can talk about it. We can stay together. And again, we need to come back into some sense of it's okay with my nervous system that I'm here, that I'm able to do this. I don't know how many of you watched Xena, the Warrior Princess. I love that show way back in the 90s. So this armor, the cover, the hardening that we call strength, is a lot of us have that metaphorical chest plate where we're really trying to protect our hearts. And, one thing that I've appreciated about Prentis's work and their book is that they keep coming from the individual to the group of us. So this cover, the hardening, disguises a terror that comes from knowing that many people have not survived and that there is an unresolved cruelty growing just below the crust of our society. Let's just take that in for a minute. That really stopped me in my tracks when I read that. Fear is a reminder that our lives are precious and precarious. So, this way of looking directly at what is and not being overtaken by it, not being taken out by it, that's the really important part of this, is that we need to be able to see what's going on. We need to be able to admit what's going on, and then we can still come back into regulation. When we create safety for ourselves just by listening, our bodies will offer up the truth. So, just a moment there when we were pausing, we were just listening basically. What's going on in my body? What are the thoughts in my mind? But mostly, what's the energy and sensation in my body? And how can I be strong and still be tender? How can we be tender with each other and also be courageous? I could have enough curiosity to consider what it meant to them, not just how I might react to it. This is partly from last week, what we were working with. And that's what our inquiry is going to be about this week as well. We change as we incorporate another's reality into our own, as we know ourselves, as we might make amends. Part of what makes us scared to tell the truth, I think, is because we're not too sure how it's going to land. We're not too sure about how other people's nervous systems are going to take that. And also, sometimes we're not very graceful. If we're in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, we might be interacting with people in a way that we kind of feel after, well, I really actually would like to have a redo on that one. Maybe there's a way I could make a repair in that. But what changes us is vulnerability, acknowledgement, and responsibility. Again, we can't hide away. We can't pretend that everything's okay. We can't pretend that we all think the same way, that we all have the same values, because clearly we don't. So, how can we work with the reality of that? Let's go into the inquiry. So, for the inquiry, just settle back. We've got about 10 minutes or so. We have a bit of time. Some people like to journal, might make a mental note. So, bring to mind someone you know or a public figure. Try not to make it a 10 out of 10 traumatic. Just somebody that you've had some interaction with, or someone that you've been following if it's a public figure. Someone whose life is different. So maybe it's someone of a different race or gender identity, person whose ideas about how the world should be are challenging for you to accept. So for me, those are two different angles. The person whose ideas about how the world should be might be a lot like me in terms of white, middle class, that kind of thing. But they might have very different ideas about my right to make decisions about my own body, for instance. Someone who's of a different race or gender identity, they might be a lot different from who I am. Also, I'm not exactly sure what their experience is, so I could have that curiosity about that as well. So then let's come into, now you've picked somebody. It doesn't have to be the perfect someone, just pick somebody. And then think about an incident that might happen, some kind of conflict. It might be something you've actually had happen or that you might imagine. And bring that up pretty vividly. Let yourself be aware of your body and notice that you're breathing. Notice that we're doing this in our mind. We're not actually in a conflict with someone right now. So, anytime if this gets to be too much, we can always open our eyes, we can look around, hold your own hands, get grounded again. But even just picking a person and then starting to think about the conflict. Well, what if I'm talking to a person of color and I say something that is racist? Or probably none of us here would do exactly that, but maybe something that is uncomfortable or shows that I'm not very aware. Or when we get nervous, often we don't interact with as much grace as we might if we were feeling more confident, more regulated. So, whatever your incident is, play it through for a minute or two in terms of what's the interaction there. Is there raised voices? Is it certain words? I've challenged people, for instance, who are, in my view, saying something is racist. Let that kind of play out enough to give yourself something to work with. Then how do you interpret their reaction to you? or their words and actions. I've had people yell at me about being queer when I'm walking down the street. Sometimes that's pretty scary. So, what is your experience with people like them as well? So, if you've had that happen many, many times, your experience is going to be different than if it only ever happened once. Let's take a few minutes here. What do you believe about them? What's your first reaction? Do you go into a what a blah, 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 freeze? Keep an eye on what's happening in your nervous system, but then really get specific. How do you interpret what they're doing? Are you scared? Do you feel judged or shamed? Sometimes, even just when we look at an image of somebody saying that or hear those words in our mind, it might activate some traumatic memories or core deficiency beliefs. So let's stay really regulated. If something's getting too intense, take the intensity out of it. Look around the room, breathe. If it's an image, you might put it on the wall on the other side of the room, put it in a frame. Look at it in the frame. Images are colors and shapes that the mind is interpreting. Right now, we're playing with the mind a little bit. We're stimulating something that has some intensity. You could always just stop that for a moment, pause, take your eyes around the empty space. A couple times in one direction, a couple times in the other direction. What does the image of that person, or maybe the words that they're saying, especially if they're showing you some kind of scorn or contempt or anger, perhaps, stay really regulated with this. We give this another minute or so. Stay present. Let yourself really get into the visualization of it as much as you can while still staying regulated. What is your idea about why they're doing what they're doing, why they believe what they believe, why they're saying these things or acting this way? And then let that come to a close. Wipe the slate clean, so to speak, for a moment. So we're going to use the same incident, but from the other person's perspective. As you're in this, sometimes when you're looking out of your own eyes at that situation, you can tell what's happening in their nervous system by the look on their face, if they're getting red, if their voice is getting angry. But from the inside of them, if you can kind of put yourself there, or maybe still from that distance, if you don't want to do that, that's fine too. So, what's happening in their nervous system? Are they in fight, flight, freeze, fawn? How is it that they're responding to you? What are they saying? And whatever it is that you were saying to them, how do they interpret your words and actions? If you've said to them, for instance, that joke is racist, I don't laugh at racist jokes, how do they interpret those words, what you said to them? And how many times and what kind of interactions do they generally have with people who believe the way you do? Are they isolated in their own reality of Fox News and whatever that might be? Or do they have a broad range of people that they interact with? Does this happen to them a lot? What's their experience with people who are more like you? And what are their beliefs about you? How would they explain the fact that you spoke up or whatever incident that you're working with? Pay some attention to that for a moment. And maybe looking out of their eyes, looking at your face, your body language, hearing the words that you're saying. How is their experience in life and their set of beliefs in life? How does that roll out into what they believe about you, why they said what they did, why they react the way they do? What's it like from their side? And then let that go for another minute or so. Notice your breath again, get grounded in your body. Look around. Let's take a minute here to notice, what did you learn from that? What are you curious about, or are you curious? When someone has a very different world view from us or different beliefs about things, it can be really challenging to understand why they believe the way they do. And maybe you already know people, many people who believe the way that this person does. And so you have a lot of experience with that already. You have a pretty good idea. And then as we finish the inquiry, offer some kindness to yourself. This isn't easy to do, this kind of inquiry, this looking into. Maybe there's a feeling has come up in your own body of fear or, well, I could have handled that better, or anger. We're kind of stirring things up with the intent to know what our body knows about this. So we have a good intention, but still it's a bit difficult. So offer yourself some kindness, maybe look around or move around a little bit. And only if it feels genuine, see about offering some kindness to the other person in this inquiry, person you know or someone you know of. And even what might you ask them if you could both regulate your nervous systems and sit down and talk about this incident? What might you want to know from them? Or do you want to sit down with them at all? Totally okay not to. Just notice what that is for you.